French author Guy de Maupassant regularly ate on the first level of the Eiffel Tower, even though he hated the sight of the thing. When asked why, he said it wasn't for the quality of the food, but it was the only place in Paris where he couldn't see the Eiffel Tower. Some were also put off by the look of the Citroën 2CV, but like the Eiffel Tower, it's grown to become a beloved symbol of French engineering success, and about as French as a croissant. It's no accident this French biscuit tin has a picture of a 2CV on it. In development for 13 years and in production for over 40, Citroën's upturned pram produced 2 offspring, but outlasted both of them. Why did it take 13 years to develop, and why did it last more than 40 years in production with almost no changes? This is a Citroën 2CV story. Citroën began life in 1919, but by 1934 the company was bankrupt, and a year later its founder, André Citroën, was dead. The company was bought by tyre maker Michelin, who underwent a review of Citroën's operations to try to find new markets both for more Citroën cars and more Michelin tyres. A market study found there was a large untapped rural population that couldn't afford a car but had a need for one. This wasn't an astonishing conclusion. Germany was in the process of building a people's car after they'd seen what Fiat was making with Mussolini's people's car, the Fiat 500 Topolino, after they'd seen what Ford was doing over in America with the Ford Model T. By the mid-1930s, Citroën had started work on a car they called an umbrella on 4 wheels. This was basic transportation, but it got a set of lofty goals. It needed to transport 4 people and 50 kilos of cargo at 30 miles an hour across muddy, unpaved roads. It should be simple to drive and maintain, essential if it would be sold to new drivers, and it would use no more than 3 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres. That's around 95 miles per imperial gallon. As I'm sure you've heard before, one goal was to transport eggs across a freshly ploughed field without breaking any of them. For such an inexpensive vehicle, these standards would be seen as tough today, but Citroën's engineers rose to the challenge. Torsion bar suspension provided a good ride. The team experimented using lights inspired by fireflies, lightweight mica windows, and to save money and weight, the car used just 1 headlight. The roof was essentially a tarpaulin. The body used corrugated sheet metal for rigidity, and the single windscreen wiper would be hand-operated, all in the goal of creating a budget car. People laud the Mini for its front-engine, front-wheel drive layout that reduced weight, but Citroën were doing exactly the same thing 20 years earlier. The result was dubbed the TPV, or Toute Petite Voiture, meaning very small car, and by 1937 20 prototypes had been built in complete secrecy. Each part was weighed to produce the car as light as possible to get the most of its tiny 3-cylinder engine. No ideas were off limits in making this new radical car. By 1939 the TPV was ready for production. By the start of September, 250 pre-production cars had been produced, brochures were printed, and preparations were made to present it at the Paris Motor Show the following month. But a dark cloud descended over Europe, and as German tanks rolled across France, Citroën destroyed or hid all pre-production cars bar 2 so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. One of these remaining cars eventually made it to Germany and Ferdinand Porsche's hands, the person responsible for the Volkswagen Beetle. He dismissed Citroën's work, describing it as more a soapbox jalopy than a people's car. Despite this, the Germans wanted the plans for the Toute Petite Voiture, but Citroën's boss refused to divulge them. Citroën's factories were given over to production for the Nazi war machine, which the French workers and management did as much as they could to disrupt. I mentioned in the DS video how Citroën's boss, Pierre-Jules Boulanger, my new hero, crafted a sneaky plan to sabotage many of the trucks they produced. After the Nazis looted his factory for tooling and put them all in rail cars for transportation, he worked with the French resistance to relabel all the rail cars. The tools ended up all over Europe, causing no end of delays and confusion. One small advantage of the war was to give its designers a lot of time to think about how they could improve their innovative car and dream of the day when it could finally start mass production. That day came with the liberation of France in 1945 and the team got to work. One of the major changes to the car was the suspension. The torsion bar setup was good, but didn't provide the smooth ride the 1930s requirements demanded. An early version of Citroën's hydropneumatic suspension was tried, but ultimately rejected. The final design was ingenious. The front and rear suspension were connected on either side with interconnected springs. When the front suspension hit a bump, it compressed the front spring, uncompressing the rear spring and pulling the rear suspension to keep the car level. Without an anti-roll bar, there was considerable body roll, but it was a clever, cost-effective system that, along with mass dampeners, created a surprisingly smooth ride. Aluminium and magnesium parts were dropped because those metals were hard to obtain after the war. Oddly enough, over in Britain, cars were using aluminium rather than steel, as aluminium was easier to get due to wartime aircraft production. The water-cooled 375cc engine had problems freezing at low temperatures, so would now be air-cooled and produced a little more power, 9 horsepower. The 3-speed gearbox got an additional overdrive gear. The car would be known as the 2 chevaux, literally 2 horses, which might seem confusing when the engine had 9 horsepower, but this was 2 fiscal horsepower, a French tax formula that depended on factors such as the number of cylinders, stroke length, bore and RPM. 2 chevaux would give the car its name, the 2CV. With the end of the war, there was hope the 2CV would finally reach production, but the French government, mindful of limited resources, only permitted Citroën to make the traction Avant, while the newly nationalised Renault got the lion's share of available steel to produce their new 4CV. This rule was to end in 1949, so Citroën's new 2CV was exhibited at the end of 1948. It was considerably more refined than the pre-war vehicle. Ferdinand Porsche hadn't been far off when he described it as more a soapbox jalopy. The 1939 car had been very unrefined. The final 2CV design wasn't exactly the height of luxury, but it looked more like a real car than something knocked up in a shed, and the 2CV probably wouldn't have achieved the success it got without the additional 9 years of development. What hadn't changed were the Michelin radial tyres, an innovation first commercialised with the introduction of the 2CV. Existing tyres used cross-ply construction. Michelin's radial tyres lasted longer, got better fuel economy and improved handling. Almost every automotive tyre produced today is radial, and it all started with Citroën's pioneering 2CV. The press were not impressed with Citroën's new car. It became the butt of many a joke with its strange looks. France was used to austerity during and after the war, but people weren't ready for something quite this basic. But with only 100,000 of the 2 million pre-war cars still on French roads and cash-strapped France needing basic transport, the 2CV was just what the doctor ordered, and Citroën was flooded with orders. But with production taking a long time to ramp up, the initial 3-year waiting list soon grew to 5 years. A few small changes appeared on the production model. An electric starter instead of a pull cord was a welcome addition, and if that failed, the engine could be hand cranked. But without a fuel gauge, customers had to use a dipstick to work out when they needed to refill. Leaving a lot of fuel in the car might not have been a good idea though, as early 2CVs didn't come with a lock for the ignition or the doors, and colours were limited to just one, grey. By 1951, production had at least reached 5 digits, and Citroën launched the first variant, a panel van called the Fourgonette. It was little more than a 2CV with the rear seats removed and a corrugated steel box on the back. But for businesses up and down the country, it was a lifesaver and greased the wheels to get the French economy moving. A weekend version even supplied a rear seat so the van could double as family transportation. Citroën was quick to sell their new hit car abroad to help France's balance of trade, first to Chile in 1953. The Chileans found the shape about as strange as the French had, and so eventually made a few modifications, producing this saloon version as the Citroënetta. Like in France, this inexpensive car took off as customers discovered the joys of the robust 2CV. The Fourgonette van was originally to get a larger 425cc engine, but Citroën's management felt customers would transplant the engine into their 2CV passenger cars to soup them up. It became clear quickly that the 375cc engine was far too little power for hauling cargo, even for a light van. Both the 2CV and the van got the updated engine in 1954, pushing the top speed to 50 miles an hour. Citroën's management needn't have worried that 2CV owners were going to become hooligans. The 2 Chevaux was slow but adequate during the day, but became next to useless at night. There were no indicators, so hand signals wouldn't help, and the speedometer didn't have a light. Both of these issues were corrected with the 1954 update. The transmission featured a new centrifugal clutch that automatically disengaged when the engine was idling, making driving in traffic much easier, but didn't allow for gear braking down steep hills. The 1954 update marked a shift to mass production, and many of the small body changes were a result of moving from welding the car together to stamping body panels. The 1950s continued with small incremental changes such as a metal boot instead of tarpaulin, and sales blossomed with more 2CVs being sold every year. In the late 1990s, Mercedes decided to put 2 engines in their tiny A-Class to make a mad racer promoted by their Formula One drivers. 40 years earlier, Citroën did the same to the 2CV as the 4x4 Sahara, France's answer to the Land Rover. A single transmission drove both front and rear engines, and the lever could put the rear engine into neutral, allowing two-wheel drive operation. Designed for French colonies in North Africa, the 2 engines could get the Sahara to 65 miles an hour. Chileans had found the 2CV look strange and had altered the shape. Citroën's factory in Slough in the UK felt the same, so did their own restyling job, producing the fiberglass Citroën Bijou in 1959. But with the Bijou costing 36% more than the Ford Popular that had more power, it wasn't very popular. The 2CV's long gestation period showed a lot of thought had gone into its design. The chassis was simple yet highly effective. It was logical then that it would be used for Citroën's next small car, the Ami in 1961, available initially as a saloon and then in 1964 as an estate. It had more conventional styling and a larger 602cc engine, leading to some nicknaming it the 3CV. The Ami had headlights shaped like lozenges, just the second car to use them, the first being the Ford Taunus a few months earlier. It went toe-to-toe with the new Renault 4, although the Renault 4 had been Renault's response to the 2CV. The 2 Chevaux also got a few minor improvements. The bonnet was updated and the new mixed hatchback launched, something between a regular 2CV and the van. Citroën continued its export drive, licensing the 2CV design to third parties in Iran, Yugoslavia and Uruguay, and Citroën manufactured both cars in Argentina. As mentioned earlier, 2CVs were produced in the UK, not just for the local market, but to allow Citroën to avoid tariffs exporting cars to the Commonwealth, selling cars in both Australia and Africa. The stripped-down practical Baby Bruce 2CV utility vehicle was conceived and produced in the Ivory Coast, but also produced in 2CV factories around the world into the 1980s. Citroën could do a major update to the 2CV, but what was the point? It was selling better than ever, bringing in money the company could use to expand its range. So, along with an innovative marketing campaign, the 1964 update focused on modernising the car for the 1960s. The engine's power had been slowly increasing since its launch, doubling to 18 horsepower. It got a real fuel gauge instead of the improvised dipstick. Seats were improved, although sitting in the middle of the rear seat was still an uncomfortable affair due to the metal bracing. The windscreen wipers had been driven off the engine, so would go faster as the speed increased. When the car was stationary, they had to be hand-operated with a handle on the dashboard. The new 2CV got wipers powered by an electric motor. The front suicide doors now opened the conventional way due to safety regulations. But despite these improvements, the 2CV was still firmly a budget car. The dashboard, if you can call it that, got an instrument cluster from the Ami in 1966, but these small changes weren't able to compete with the modern Renault 4 that was eating into its sales, and the Ami was too expensive. So 3 years after the 2CV update, Citroën decided on a major change. The Renault 4 sold on its practical tailgate, so it was agreed to do the same to the 2CV, even though Citroën's management were never fans of hatchbacks and some called the design utilitarian. To minimise cost, it would use the existing 2CV chassis and production line, and a simplified body meant it would be cheaper to produce. Citroën's designers were busy on updating the DS and AMI, so gave the work to Panhard, another car company that Citroën had recently purchased. The car would be called the Citroën Diane. It received the 2CV's 425cc engine, but a year later the AMI's 600cc engine was also available. Inside it was still Spartan, but it remained good basic transportation. The Diane went on sale in 1967 alongside the 2CV, with the hope it would eventually replace the venerable car. After all, the 2CV had been launched in post-war austere France, and by the late 1960s, customers wanted a little bit more refinement. The 2CV's simple yet effective suspension was still finding uses 20 years after it launched. It had spawned the fourgonette truck, the AMI, the Diane, several international versions. In 1968, the new Mehari appeared. It was designed to replace the off-roading Sahara and was essentially an official Citroën version of the Baby Bruce using newer Diane parts. It didn't have the Sahara's complex four-wheel drive system though, but the 2CV's Go Anywhere chassis, a larger 600cc engine, combined with a Jeep-inspired lightweight plastic body, made it a capable off-roader. Despite the Mehari supposedly replacing the Baby Bruce, it would continue to be produced around the world in limited numbers and would be updated as a Citroën Pfaff in 1973. Pfaff might be English colloquial for something that's too much trouble to do, but Citroën's meaning was quite the opposite. Pfaff stood for Facile à fabriquer, facile à financer, or easy to build, easy to fund. It was designed so at least half of the parts could be made locally to reduce import duties and provide employment. To this end, the plastic bodywork was replaced by simple metal panels that were welded and then hand-painted. The AMI saloon got a new shape in 1968, and Citroën would start offering higher-powered engines. The still experimental Wankel rotary engine was offered from 1969 in limited numbers to loyal Citroën customers, what we'd now call beta testers. And it seemed tests were successful, as the thirsty rotary engine would be offered in the Citroën GS 4 years later. A larger 1-litre engine borrowed from the Citroën GS would appear in the AMI Super from 1975, although engines this large in small cars were taxed heavily in France, and it wasn't a popular choice. The Diane was supposed to be the second generation 2CV, but the first generation kept on selling. Maybe 2CV customers liked the classic 2CV looks, maybe they just wanted a good deal. Whatever the reason, the AMI, Diane and 2CV continued to sell well, and by 1970 the first generation actually outsold the second generation. That wasn't supposed to happen. Regardless, Citroën knew a good thing when they saw it, so produced yet another small 2CV update. The larger 600cc engine from the AMI and Diane gave the 2CV6 a little more power, with the existing engine sold as the 2CV4. The larger engine officially made it 3 fiscal horsepower, or a 3CV. The rear lights from the AMI turned 90 degrees were used to reduce the parts across the range. The van was still on sale and took advantages of all these updates. With the introduction of the Renault 5 in 1972, Citroën's whole small car lineup was suddenly looking decidedly dated. Their finances, sapped by failing sales of the Citroën SM, buying companies such as Panhard, Berliet and Maserati, and the failed Wankel rotary engine project meant little money for the rest of their range. Instead of a new model, Citroën turned the Diane's door handles upside down. Small changes were all they could do, although sales of the entire 2CV range peaked at 422,000 in 1974 thanks to the fuel crisis that led customers rushing to economical cars. In fact, there was once again a waiting list to get this 26-year-old car. But record sales from a range that had received little investment wasn't enough to keep Citroën in business, and they declared bankruptcy in 1975. Despite this, a small update, or should that be a downgrade, to the 2CV appeared that same year, the 2CV Special. By now the 2CV had received rectangular headlights, but the Special got the traditional round headlights and the older dashboard from the 1960s. The Special was stripped back to make it the inexpensive entry-level car it had been when it launched, and it still had the original car's basic air vent setup, just a flap underneath the windscreen to let air in, with the grille to make sure that leaves and bugs didn't end up in the cabin. The doors were so thin they couldn't accommodate wind-down windows, so still used the original flap-up design. The French government persuaded Peugeot to take on ailing Citroën. Clearly the company needed a new small car, so the Citroën Visa was hurriedly rushed to market in 1977, using many parts from the Peugeot parts bin, and the Citroën Ami ended production the following year. But Peugeot, like Citroën, also saw value in continuing to sell the 2CV, while there was nostalgia for it or a desire to buy a cut-price car. The 2CV van was updated with the Diane's body as a Citroën Arcadian in 1977. This allowed Citroën more time to produce a van based on the Visa, the C15, which launched in 1984. Citroën used letters like AZ to denote 2CV variants, and AK was the letter code for its van, so Arcadian was a play on the words of AK and Diane. I suppose you had to be there to get the joke. A four-wheel drive version of the Mahari showed there was still life in the 2CV's revolutionary suspension, which was little changed since its introduction. Rather than the odd two-engine setup of the Sahara, the 4x4 Mahari relied on one engine with a transfer box and a differential lock. It might not be able to climb the 45-degree slopes marketers claimed, but it was a highly competent off-roader. During the 1980s, Citroën understandably ignored the 2CV and focused all its resources on new models such as the AX and BX. That was where the future lay after all. The 2CV got an outing in the Bond film For Your Eyes Only, and special editions such as the Charleston and the Dolly with traditional round headlights drummed up some interest. By tuning the 600cc engine, Citroën got 29 horsepower, getting the 2CV to just over 70 miles an hour. Diane production ended in 1983, meaning the 2CV outlived the car that was designed to replace it. It even outlived the Citroën Visa, introduced in 1978. But the 2CV was trading on its quirky style and nostalgia. Even Brits who'd been turned off the 2CV's looks in the 1950s warmed to the tin snail after seeing thousands of them roaming French roads while on their summer holidays, buying their own when they got home. It also became a car for the counterculture, for people who didn't want to conform with a standard three-box design. And in the late 1980s, more 2CVs were being sold in West Germany than France, as Germans took the car to their hearts. But as Super Minis took over, demand dwindled. It wasn't even that cheap. Without a single robot working in the factory, Citroën relied on manual labour to build each car. The last 2CV rolled off the production line in 1990 after 42 years. The 2CV's nemesis, the Renault 4, ended production 2 years later. Citroën had plans to sell the tooling to China, but it seems the Chinese would rather walk than drive a 2CV and passed on the opportunity. Production of the venerable 2CV may have ended, but the whole saga got a fitting coda. Two of the 1930s prototypes were known to survive. One was just a rolling rig for tyre testing, but before the war some additional cars had been squirreled away, some being buried in fact. After the war, none had been discovered, but in 1995, 3 were found in the roof of a French barn. In 2007, Andy Saunders celebrated both the 2CV and Pablo Picasso with his 2CV Picasso creation, and a year later, for the 2CV's 60th birthday, French leather goods company Hermès refitted a 2CV in leather to celebrate this French icon. Chrysler's designers were inspired to create a concept inspired by the 2CV, the CCV, in 1997, and Nissan created the wittily titled S-Cargo, standing for small cargo, and the French word for that thing that might look a little bit like the 2CV and moved about as fast. It was, of course, inspired by the fourgonette van. But at 8,000 sold, it sold less than 0.1% of the 2CV during its 2-year short life. But since the 2CV ended production, there hasn't been a serious attempt to recreate a new version. The AMI name returned in 2020 as a tiny EV, but it bears no relation to the original friendly car. The closest thing to a 2CV you can buy today may be the 2022 Fourgonette. Underneath it's a Citroën Berlingo crafted by Italian coach builder Casellani. It looks sort of like a 2CV van if you squint really hard. It's a testament to the 2CV's robustness that almost 90 years after it was conceived, it's not uncommon to come across one on a French street, and it's a characterful car that still brings a smile to your face. It wasn't the fastest car, it didn't have the most features. Jasper Carrott once joked it didn't have central locking, but you could reach all 4 doors from the driver's seat. But with sales of almost 9 million variants, it's a testament to the ingenuity of its designers who spent the war designing a car that kick-started the economy once the war ended and got millions of families on the road for the first time. The SM might have helped Citroën into bankruptcy, but like the DS, it was a forward-thinking car with many firsts. And if you want to know more about it, there's a video on the right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.